What's going on, Photoshop fam? Welcome back to the Pixel Laundry Photoshop Academy 101 class. Today is lesson 4 in our 101 series for beginners on how to use Photoshop. We're going to be learning about layers. Stick around. What's up, Photoshop fam? I'm Rick Navarro, and this is the Pixel Laundry Photoshop Academy. Alright guys, so today we're going to be learning about layers, alright? And I mentioned this in a previous episode, but layers are basically transparencies in layers, like transparent onion skins that you can see through. If you were to lay them on the table, you would be looking at them from a top-down sort of view, and they work in transparent layers, kind of like acetate or like those plastic sheets of paper that your teacher or a professor may have given notes on in high school or college. So in Photoshop, they work exactly the same way. And the power of layers is that they let you work on individual components of your document in Photoshop and allow you to work non-destructively. We've been talking about non-destructively several times in our previous lessons. And again, here is no different. Layers allow you to work in a way that allow you to make edits or adjustments or manipulations on your image without affecting the entire image or a background image, and they allow you to build stackable layers in order for you to be able to create an entire composition. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of layers, and we'll get right into it. Okay, so this is a project I worked on for the Super Bowl. And I was hired out for an agency job, and we basically created this composition completely from scratch. There was a photo shoot done of Melissa McCarthy, and everything else you see here was either done in post or in CG. The car is actually the only thing that's CG. Everything else is a collection of photos. And over here, you can see this is my layers palette. Now this is a little bit different from my normal teaching workspace, but I wanted you to see what layers look like in a real world situation where there are a lot of them, okay, and why they're powerful and how you can use them. So I pulled out my layers palette. If you haven't already, if you are working in, like, let's say a default workspace, let's just go ahead and go here. Okay, your layers will come up automatically, but if for some reason they're not, if you go under your window and you click on your layers, your layer palette will come up. And as you can see, there are a ton of layers here. Now, I just recently read that Photoshop will allow you to have as many layers as your computer can handle. So I heard at one point it was like 999,000, some ridiculously high number. But the official word, I think, from Adobe is that you can have as many layers as your RAM can handle. So if you've got a large amount of RAM, and I'm assuming if you're working in a graphics platform, you should have a fairly decent amount of RAM to be working with, that you have a lot of RAM, and Photoshop will use as much as you can give it. If you bring up your preference plane and go to performance, the performance tab, you can see here that you can allocate a certain amount of RAM specifically towards Photoshop, especially if you're working on high-end images or very heavy or very large images. You are going to want to allocate a lot of memory towards it so that it can function and move very fluidly. Here I've allocated about 70% of my RAM towards Photoshop when I'm working in Photoshop. And I have about 16 gigs of RAM on this particular machine, but this particular machine is also a brand new 2019 machine. So the graphics card is pretty up to speed. 16 is really all I need, especially for the type of work that I do. More is obviously better. If I could get, a 32 gig, that would be amazing. But 16 is where I have it. 8 is probably about as low as I would go. I've got a machine upstairs, a small laptop that has 4, and it works a little slow. But I don't do a lot of heavy editing on that. That's more like my travel and business machine. I use it very, very lightly in Photoshop, but I use it more like heavy for email and word processing and business, sort of applications. But when it comes to graphics, this is my graphics machine, and this is where I do a lot of my heavy lifting. So allocate your machine accordingly, and then that way you'll know your machine will be able to handle it. Now, let's look at these layers. In here, you're going to see all sorts of different layer types. You're going to see full-on adjustment layers, which we just did a video on adjustment layers. If you haven't checked that out right here. And you're going to see layer groups, which are these little folders right here. And this is where I am organizing my workflow in folders so that I can move very quickly and find things that I need to find. This is a layer group right here. You're also going to find masks. And let's see, you're going to find color coordination here. This is where I have color coordinated my layers, not only in groups, not only in folders, but in layers as well. And that again allows me a further level of control. You're going to find smart objects, which we're going to talk about here in a second. You're going to find regular layers. You're also going to find layers that have layer effects on them, like this one. This has got a drop down of layer effects and smart filters, which is a part of the smart objects. And you've got this little click that will open and close these. These are kind of like folders within themselves. Also, they're also self-encompassing layers. So if I double click on that, it's actually going to open up another window. But this is just an example. I don't want this to confuse you. I just wanted you to see this so that you have an idea of what the power of layers will provide for you as a creator. And so let's go ahead and just take a look at what you might be looking at with a more simple layer. First thing I want you to notice is that when you open up your photo or your image, it's going to have a background layer, and that background layer is going to be locked. In previous versions of Photoshop, you have to double click on this and it would bring up this little new layer dialog, and if you hit OK, it would unlock it for you. Now all you have to do is click on the layer and the lock goes away. That's important because of the non-destructive philosophy that we've been talking about. When you're working non-destructively, you kind of always want to have a base layer to be able to go back to. Okay, and all non-destructively means, if you haven't seen the previous videos on non-destructive editing, is that we are working in a way that is not going to destroy the original image. You always have the original image to go back to. And that's a really good thing, because if for some reason your file gets messed up or your machine gets messed up or something happens, you're going to want that original image to be able to source and reference from as you're making continual edits further on down the line. So let's go ahead and put that back, and what I'm going to do is work on a duplicate layer. Now that's the first thing, is how do you duplicate a layer, right? So I can grab this layer. You can do it a couple different ways. I can grab this layer right here and drag it down into this little plus icon down here, and it will automatically duplicate it. That's one way. Or I can select it. This little highlight, the highlight on here tells me which layer I'm selected on. I can select it, and on my Mac, if I hold Command and hit J, I can duplicate it there. If I go over to my layer menu set, I can also click on duplicate layer there. It's asking me which layer, duplicate. There it is. Okay, so you can do the same thing several different ways in Photoshop. So let's keep on looking at this layer palette and see what else we got here. Up here, by default, your background layer will come in locked, as I mentioned. If I duplicate that, I also have further options that will allow me to lock this particular layer in different ways. So with the correct layer selected, if I go over here to this little lock section, you're going to see this first icon, which that basically means you're going to lock out the transparent pixels. So for example, if for some reason I made a selection, let's just say like this, and I duplicated that so that now if I turn everything else off, I now have a transparent background in addition to that. If I hit the transparent lock button, okay, it's going to allow me to paint or edit everything inside of my selection. Basically, all the transparent portion of the picture has been locked. Now you can no longer edit that. So if I grab a brush here, and let's just say I tried to paint or edit on the outside, notice that it's just stopping on the edge. It's not allowing me to paint in the transparencies, where if I take it off, now I can paint everywhere. Okay, so that's what transparent lock does. Brushing would basically not allow me to do any sort of brush edits. So if I grab my brush here, you'll notice that the cursor, once it's pulled over the picture, is now a cross out symbol, and that's basically meaning I can't do any brushing or editing of brushing on that particular type. This is also true of anything that's going to be using a brush type of tool. The stamp tool, the brush tool, the history brush. It won't even let me duplicate it. Could not make a new layer from the selection because the layer is locked. It's got a lock on it, so you can't do that. This one right here looks very similar to this right here. In fact, it's exactly the same thing. It's the move tool. If I use the move lock, it's not going to allow me to move this layer at all, could not use the move tool because the layer is locked. There you go, okay? This one has to do with artboards. There you go, prevent auto nesting into and out of artboards and frames. And artboards are another type of workspace, another way to work. Haven't really talked too much about them, probably won't talk too much about them inside of this 101 course, but it's there in case you use it later on. Okay, and then we just have a good old-fashioned lock, which is basically all the above. It's just not gonna let you do anything to that layer at all. Couldn't move it because it's locked. All right, so those are your lock layers, or your lock options, I should say. And let's go up to this next section. So this next section here has a drop down, and this drop down is known as your blending modes. Basically, if I was to put it in a nutshell, how I would explain it to you is these different modes allow you to see this particular layer as you're adjusting the mode and how it interacts with the layers above or below it. I'm not going to explain every single one of these. Instead, what I am going to do is put inside of the show notes a description of all of the definitions and the functions of each of these options right here. Let's go ahead and put a fill layer. Let's just say we'll make this a fun color and put that above. In these more recent versions of Photoshop, I believe CC and above, and maybe even 5 and 6, if I just scroll down, it will show you, it'll give you a preview as to what that blending mode option is going to do to that layer. And you can see how it interacts with the image below it to give you different effects and visual options, okay? So if I just kind of scroll down, you can see it's changing my image, and what it's doing is interacting with the layer directly below it. This is interacting with the image below it based on the parameters that particular image is in. But what if we duplicated that and put it below it and also changed the blending mode of the layer below it? That's also going to give us a whole lot of different options, okay? And again, any of these layers can be used in conjunction with masks to isolate and to kind of separate portions or large sections of the image. So if I wanted an effect to be only applied to, let's just say, oh, that's cool, very Joker-esque. Let's just say I wanted, for some reason, this to have a mask on it to be applied just to, let's say, the hair or to the glasses. I can do that by adding the mask, and that brings us down to these buttons down here. So this is your mask button, and if I apply that mask, and with my black and white brush, I have it selected, I can paint on or off the effect. But just so that you know, you've got that option available to you. And that's what blending modes are. Blending modes are going to change how the pixels interact with the layer above or below it. Again, I'm going to put definitions for all of these individual blending modes in the show notes below, so be sure to check that out. Right next to our blending mode, we've got this option called opacity. If I put my cursor directly over the opacity, the word opacity, it's going to turn into this slider, little left and right slider. And what opacity does is it changes the opaqueness or the transparency of that particular layer. Let's go ahead and put a solid color. Again, we'll do a fun color because it's easier to see. And we're going to put that layer below our layer that we're working on. Now remember, like I said in the opening, these work in transparent layers. So if I change the transparency on a layer above, I'm going to be able to see the layer below. So if I go right here, bring my cursor up and start to drop this down, we are making the image a little bit more or less opaque depending on what direction you go. If you click on this little button right here, there's a slider option that will allow you to do that. Another way to change the transparency is just with your numbers. On your keyboard, if you tap on 1 through 0, it's going to change the opacity. What you do want to make sure is that you're on the move tool before you do that. And if you'll notice, as I'm tapping the numbers, the opacity amount is changing. 7, 8, 9, back to 100 is 0. If I want half or increments, I'm going to tap those numbers a little bit more quickly. So if I want like 65, or if I want 78 level of opacity, or 24, you can see. If I just hit 2, it's just going to go to the top of that, whatever tens place that is. So 10, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way to 100, back to 0. Okay, but trick to that is you do want to make sure that you have the move tool selected. If you are on something else, what's going to happen is that you're more than likely going to change one of the options up here. So if you're on a different tool, this is my little workaround. If you're on a tool and you're trying to change the opacity with a hotkey and for some reason it's not doing it, make sure that you're not up in the tool palette or in the tool options bar and changing parameters up there as opposed to being down in your layers palette or making sure that the opacity on the actual layer is actually changing. And my workaround for that is just to make sure I'm on the move tool, because with the move tool, there are no parameters or tolerance settings at the top. So I know it's going to force it to work inside of the layer. We didn't talk about this one, but I want to talk about it while we're talking about opacity. It's called the fill layer. And the fill layer, for all intents and purposes, it basically also adjusts your transparency. However, it's actually adjusting the fill component of the image. Now, it's a little bit harder to see, but it works more obvious if you're applying a layer style, which we'll talk about in a moment. But for right now, let's just go ahead and apply what we call a layer style, which is over here in your effects tab. Let's go ahead and duplicate this right here. And we're going to apply a stroke to that. This is our layer styles palette. It is an effect controller, if you will. I'm able to add effects here in this particular options box. If I grab the opacity slider and slide this down on that particular layer, it's going to affect the transparency of both the effect and the fill, which essentially is what's happening on the inside. If I do that with just the fill layer, it's only going to affect the opacity of what's inside of the effect, which is the fill portion. So this is like your major difference between opacity and fill. You can basically use them in conjunction with each other or in exchange for each other, but know that if you've got layer styles or layer effects on your layer, that is how it's going to be different. Okay, the transparency of the fill versus the entire layer is affected by those two separate parameters. Now, while we're talking about effects, let's just go ahead and bring that up. So as I mentioned, down here also you've got a few other options. You have this little effects tab, okay? You've got blending options, which we just kind of talked about. And if you bring up the layer style palette, your blending options, right here you're gonna see your blend modes, which we've already talked about, which is also here. But you've also got all these other little options: drop shadow, outer glow pattern, so on and so forth, okay? And these are all super, super cool because they will allow you to do different cool things to your effects. And these effects will also apply to text layers. So if I go here and let's just say we'll add a drop shadow, I can affect all sorts of different parameters and give my images different looks with these. Now notice that it's highlighted. What this little plus means is that you can, just like in your layers palette down below, you can add additional layers of effects. So if I click on here, I can add more drop shadows, and that allows me more individual control. Whereas before, maybe you would be able to do one effect and you'd have to manipulate that and then maybe duplicate that as an entire layer. I can add individual layers, again, keeping everything separate and deleting them if I don't need. And the way you're going to get rid of them is you're just going to either uncheck them or delete them right here with the little trash can down below.